All right. Welcome back to, I guess, another Nerdcast. EJ, you were part of the relaunch of the Nerdcast that then promptly died as I went right back to the Box Score Geek show. We were debating trying to get you on there, but actually we want to talk with EJ Fischer, so keep you in the loop. My name's Andres Alvarez, aka Nerd Numbers. I guess this is the Nerdcast. Don't worry, we'll make sure it's housed somewhere fine. My guest is, by the way, do you prefer EJ or Eugene? Because I saw on Twitter you changed it to Eugene.
I don't really care. As it says on the About section of my website, it's entirely up to you.
All right, well, we'll do Eugene EJ Fischer, right? You know, maybe you can go with a cooler nickname as you get more famous, right? And we're going to be talking basically sci-fi. This is old hat. For those of you that have followed us, as I said, one of my favorite moments is these are now taken down. I'm in the process of housekeeping and may put them back up. You and I did some recordings for a podcast, the Nerd Numbers podcast, a while back that was short-lived while I was figuring out where to live on the net. I took those down, the podcast, but I left the YouTube things up, and some people found them and then yelled at me because in them I had promised notes. If you follow me as a podcaster, this podcast will probably be no different. I put up extensive notes after podcasts, and I had just started getting into the habit, and then I fell behind and never did it. But you had fans that were enough that they found a 200 hit YouTube conversation with you within like minute 67, a promise that I would leave notes, and they were like, "Where are the notes?"
Let that stranger down, Dre. I hope you feel appropriately chagrined that you
No, I just pulled down the video. That was my response. They were like, "Where are the notes?" And I was like, "Deleted." You wrote a novella that we talked about. This was homework that I actually took to heart because you've given me homework on like 3 podcasts, and I think I'm like 1 for 3. I'm failing
but
in
if
class.
you were going to do one, this was the one.
All right. So you wrote a novella called The New Mother.
This is the April-May double issue. It's the issue of Asimovs that is on store shelves right now. If you went to Barnes & Noble in the periodical section, you'd probably be able to buy one of these. Or if you have an independent bookstore that stocks science fiction literary magazines.
Or if you've got a Kindle that glows like this, you can get it in pressing the button.
Kindle editions. There's an iOS edition through Newsstand. There's a Nook edition. There's Kobo. There's Android through the Google Play Store, and there's Magster. You can get it. You can read it online through Magster. Also, there's like an 8,500 word excerpt on Asimov's website. And if you do show notes for this, you can link to a post where I aggregated all these links in one place.
Awesome, and I will do that. That makes my life much easier, by the way. But yeah, it was a fantastic story. You, like I said, it was homework. You were like, when it's out, I'll send it to you. You can read it. I had a few plane rides, so I ended up reading it on that, and that was fantastic. So what I wanted to start with was kind of what I call the spoiler-free section, so just kind of premise of the story, stuff like that. Not going to ruin anything, and when we get to spoiler territory, we'll let you know. So if you haven't read it, it doesn't take that long. I forgot to time myself. I meant to because we had a discussion about that. It's a really quick read, and I got some funny comments on that when we get there too. So first off, you've got front billing on Asimovs Magazine. That seems like a big deal. Like, you are the cover. That's huge.
I love it, too. So the artist here is a guy named Gary Freeman. It took me a while to manage to get in touch with him. I need a copy of this for my wall. And the art director for Asimovs came up with the layout design. And then Gary read the story and came up with lots of sort of ideas of how to illustrate it. And I think he did a fantastic job. We've got these 5 women that all have the same face. We've got these sort of spermatozoan-looking female symbols streaking out. There's the male arrow above her head that's sort of dissolving into smoke. And of course, you know, the pregnant woman front and center on the cover. All things that are sort of strongly thematically resonant of the story. So yeah, I love it. I think that it's a really great piece of art. And also, this is the first time I've been on the cover of anything. It's my first time sort of sending fiction out into the world, like making up people and having pictures of them come back. So that's also been very exciting.
How does one, for aspiring writers, get to be the cover story of Asimovs? Like, how did that happen for you?
The way you get stories in these magazines, really the way you get short fiction in any sort of short fiction publication in the science fiction or fantasy realm is you just submit. All of these publications will have submissions guidelines, will tell you how to submit. So you write something, you put together a cover letter, you send it in. Back when I was first doing it, I had to do it by mail. And the editor from Asimovs, Sheila Williams, liked my work back in 2010, bought a story from me. And then when I would see her at conventions over the years in between, she would always say, "So when are you going to send something else to me?" And I was always saying, "I'm sure I'm going to have something for you soon. I'm just in graduate school right now." And I eventually started thinking that she must have stopped believing me. She must think that I'm just blowing her off. But there aren't that many places that publish novella-length fiction. It's a really hard length to publish. Novella is, I think, over 17,500 words. And The New Mother is almost 20,000 words. It's a hard length to sell, but Asimovs is one of the places that sells it. So I sent it to Sheila to see if she wanted it, and she was really passionate about the story. And as for how it got made the cover, I guess she just liked it enough that she decided to make it the cover.
All right, so actually on that, this is a, I guess I'm going to let you. So again, spoiler free, and you're the author, so like you're allowed, if you want to just spoil, like if you want to tell the internet Dumbledore dies at the end, I got no complaints. It's your story. It's your take. But kind of a spoiler-free overview of the story or premise or whatever you want to give to the listeners.
So I'll tell you. I'll wait to get into spoilers until you, as the host, are ready for a spoilerific discussion. But here's sort of my elevator pitch. When people say, "What is this story about?" I say it's about a sexually transmitted infection which causes gamete diploidy, and what that means is. Men who get it become sterile carriers, and women, fertile women, are at risk for self-impregnating with a clone whenever they ovulate. And the story sort of looks at how the spread of this condition starts to change society.
And again, we'll wait more towards spoilers, but then like adding to that pitch from like my read, what you do really interesting is you look a lot at what are the implications of if this disease, or whatever you want to call it, what are the implications to the world with this happens, which I think is, especially now when we're looking at, like the idea of marriage or being between a man and a woman, a huge part of that is, the ability to procreate. And so when we're now even looking at like Indiana and the Final Four and that being front and center in politics, this idea of a man and a woman being the staple of a marriage or a family or whatever, not saying I agree, by the way, for the listeners, just saying that's a lot of politics. You added like a completely new spin to what that means, and we'll talk more about that, I'm sure. But that's what I thought was fascinating is you said you did this as like a master's story. I found that fascinating because it seemed really topical for a lot of stuff that's going on right now.
One of the reasons this was an attractive notion to me was that women's reproductive rights have often been used historically and still as sort of a proxy battleground for other political issues. And so it seemed like by placing my speculative conceit, my sort of science fictional tweak on the world within the realm of reproduction, I could make one small change that would then give me access to lots and lots of sort of social fracture lines that I would be able. It seemed like a sort of single little thought experiment that let me then approach lots of other things.
Talked about this before in terms of science fiction and good science fiction and bad science fiction. And basically, that's kind of one of the things you've mentioned is for good science fiction, you kind of have a scientifically based change or addition or whatever to the world. And then what are the consequences of that?
Its connection to the sciences isn't necessarily like it has to be based on real science. Its connection to the science is the rhetorical way you explore the fictional universe is rhetorically scientific.
I find that's good writing, and even if it's not really steeped in what you could call realism, although your story I find definitely is, the right way to write is you kind of have to examine what this would mean and how it would follow, and that's where I find I dislike a lot of stories is where you go, this, not even logically, because human beings aren't always logical, but this storyline doesn't follow from the premises you've given me. So something that's fascinating to me on your story, by the way, because you weren't aware of this, is my wife actually had an ovarian cyst, and what that means is basically during ovulation, an egg just suddenly says, "Hey, guess what? I'm going to start growing." Now, normal reproduction wise, right? You get a sperm, it settles, right? And it settles in the uterus and it grows, and 9 months later. I think I'm getting that right. If I'm getting sex ed wrong, please, you've got the internet. You guys can go look it up. What I'm saying is that's the point, is an ovarian cyst can occur when basically an egg, without the benefit of a sperm, just suddenly says, boom, I'm going to try and be a baby. And it can't, right? It doesn't have all the required stuff. There's lots of genetics that people much smarter than me understand. And that can actually be problematic because it just starts growing where it's at. And in this case, it required surgery. My wife's mother was a registered nurse and was really interested in this. She actually got a picture of it. Nurses are morbid because these will start growing like teeth and body parts, these ovarian cysts. Look them up on the net. They're really creepy. But basically, what you were already talking about, basically in the book as the premise is, what if a woman could just essentially clone herself? What if her egg could just, basically...
The term for this, by the way, is parthenogenesis. My story is about communicable parthenogenesis.
I'll use the simple words. You can use the real word. But yeah, I found it fascinating that when I brought that up, I was like, wow, did you know about this? Because, I have experience with it. You were like, I hadn't heard of that. So to me, that was fascinating that you came up with this premise of a story without necessarily hearing that. So that's, to me, was like... Was this story was this just a random thought experiment, not much like looking into biology as a start?
No, it definitely, it was looking into biology as a start. It just wasn't looking into human biology as a start.
Oh, interesting.
So this condition I described, gamete diploidy syndrome, in the story, well, it has several names in the story, but most commonly called gamete diploidy syndrome, was inspired by an actual bacterium called Wolbachia, which exists in bugs. Like, there are tons of different strains of it in tons of different insects. And, if you were an aphid, Dre, you could just be going about your business, eating some leaves, getting occasionally milked by ants, being a sexual reproducer, and you could get a bacterial infection that just turned you into an asexual reproducer. This is a thing that exists in nature. There is a bacterium that turns bugs into parthenogenetic reproducers. And when I read about this, I thought, oh, well, obviously there's a science fiction story there.
Well, bugs in general, they terrify me because, right, bugs and mice, there's also the I don't know if it's bacteria or whatever, but mice can get infected with this thing where they just try and get eaten by cats, right? That's the big one.
Right, toxoplasmosis.
Yes. And then also a popular one, right, is ants can get a brain infection that makes them crawl to get eaten as well. And it's you have these things
fungus, I think.
Yeah, you have these things that can infect you that basically take over your brain and make you act differently. That's a completely other realm. But yeah, nature is terrifying.
These are all in the category of parasites. Wolbachia is what you would call a cellular parasite as opposed to a multicellular parasite. GDS in my novella is an intracellular parasite. But these are all parasites that sort of change the behavior of some parts of these biological systems we're describing.
So I actually want to get into spoilers, but I will give that last time. How much research because you're listing tons of stuff. How much research did you do for this story in terms of getting all of this stuff?
I did a lot of research, but I would say most of it was not in the realm of biology. Most of the research I did was social research. I did a lot of reading, for example, about the various social responses to the AIDS epidemic. I did a lot of reading about, how do sort of subcultural communities self-organize. The majority of the research I did for this was social, not biological. I had sort of one afternoon sitting with a microbiologist asking him questions.
Let's actually just get into spoilers on that. And actually that was what really, by the way, as a compliment, I feel I'm a scientist because this is the rough part where I'm after I read it, I was like, there is absolutely no way for me to actually give a candid critique of your work because I'm really good friends with you. And there's also I feel this is a cheat. If I was ever on a cooking show, right, one of those Gordon Ramsay, whatever, if you make me pizza, you win. I don't care. There's lots of good meals you can make. There's lots of really talented chefs out there that can do really complicated things that require lots of intelligence, lots of knowledge of herbs, spices, cooking techniques. I'm going to choose pizza over 99.9% of those. I mean, that's to me. So like this thing I felt was a cheat code because it was a really interesting story written by a friend that also hit a lot of, things that hit home for me. But I loved it. So I'll give you that. I feel that's mean that I'm giving you the precursor. I'm like, this was shooting fish in a barrel, EJ. But I did love this story. And the biggest part I loved about it, well, maybe not the biggest, but one of the huge aspects I love about it was what you were saying, that social component, because I have like family members, everybody does. I have family members that I disagree with on Facebook about various social issues. And a common one that comes up is, women's reproductive rights, pro-choice, and then as well as pro-life. That always bugged me as a term on the other side, but we can leave that alone for now. And then, like gay marriage. And that's showing up a ton right now, especially with, as I mentioned, for those of you listening in the future, the NCAA Final Four is going on right now. In Indiana, basically just tried to pass a law that they claim is defending religious freedom, but really just means we want to discriminate against gay people. And even major organizations like the NBA and NCAA are actually fighting back. I found this fascinating. You brought up the AIDS epidemic because you've got people like Charles Barkley who are coming out against Indiana being against gay marriage. And I'm remembering back to when Magic Johnson was essentially shoved out of the league when he came out with AIDS, and just the NBA itself, like, if you look at how they treated gay people, people with AIDS, all that kind of stuff back in the day, the NBA is not even 20 years removed from being the villain in this story. And yet the world has shifted. So if suddenly you removed men from the equation of reproduction, what kind of social reaction this would have. And you actually gave me kind of again, we're in spoiler territory. You kind of got me off on a weird foot because you started this off with a basically crazy cult leader that has essentially spayed a bunch of women with this condition because he views it as an abomination, because they're not real, like the question of if it's a real pregnancy, if they're a real baby, and the world responding, like agreeing with it, which really does strike home with a lot of stuff we're seeing now.
Yeah, I mean, I wanted to, with the story, I wanted to place this story sort of at the moment when the condition enters the public consciousness. And it seemed to me that would be sort of analogous to, like, if you took the AIDS epidemic, things like, there were like some notable celebrity deaths, and there was this letter. It was like, I can't even remember the number now, but a number like 1093 and counting or something. Like their various different communities had sort of different trigger points where, like, this was the event that made people start going, whoa, something's happening here. And before that, it had just been spreading quietly for a number of years. And because the story I wanted to tell was sort of right at the point where everyone was scrambling to get a handle on things, I needed an inciting event. And it seemed that this, a sort of flashy raid on a compound, sort of like, happened a few years ago with the fundamentalist offshoot Mormon sect that was raided because of child brides. In Texas, it's something similar to that happens. There's sort of a seclusionary religious compound in Texas where they figure out that someone on the compound has been having these cloned babies, and they opt to surgically sterilize them, and word gets out, and they get raided, and it becomes sort of an issue of national interest.
On that note, something interesting, how much did this apply to you? I guess this is a trope at this point, and I'll rib you a little about it. But you're a writer, basically writing about a writer, which is
you get one. You get one. I hadn't done it before. I figured this was my one. But not a fiction writer, a journalist. The main character in the story is a journalist, and it's a device. It's an expository device to give her access to the various different viewpoints that are going on around this issue. But she's not just a device. I feel that she's fairly well developed as a character as well. She's got a lot of personal stuff going on. She has a personal stake in it. The main character is a woman named Tess Mendoza, who is a lesbian freelance journalist who is herself pregnant when the story starts, and she starts reporting on it.
So basically, she's looking at a story. These women are randomly starting to, basically procreate, essentially clone themselves, as you point out. and it's only in women, right? So obviously, and they have only female babies. And one of the things you touched on there, which, like I said, is really touching on a lot of the stories going on with stuff like Lean In, the End of Men with I forget her last name. It's Hannah something. But the End of Men, I think she wrote a book like on the sociologic impacts. Women are starting to enter more jobs, more college degrees, et cetera, et cetera. So long-term impact of that. You touched on the idea of like, what if men become extinct? And that was a really fascinating story. I'm sorry, I'm jumping all over the place. But the question I was going to ask is, the journalist you have, she's pregnant, and it doesn't occur to her until I think about midway through the story that she might actually be a carrier from essentially, she's, as you mentioned, she's a lesbian, so she got a donor, and the idea that she could actually from a donor have been infected with this and now may not be able to procreate normally and may only be able to, and may actually start having, clones of herself, which can possibly occur every ovulation cycle. That was really fascinating to me.
Yeah, I mean, it's left ambiguous in the story, sort of how likely that is. It said that it would be very unlikely, but is within the realm of possibility, and it's something that she's anxious about. She's a character who doesn't, in general, need help feeling anxious about things, and has this sort of hanging over her. I thought that it would be sort of an interesting way to personalize her relationship with the material that she was reporting on, because one of the things that I wanted to investigate were sort of the rhetorics of partisanship. Every person that she talks to in the story is partisan in some way or another, and she herself is partisan, and you can sort of, I hope, if I've done my job, see the tensions between sort of the notional stance of objectivity she's trying to adopt, but her actual sort of partisan motivations, and hopefully how they're informed by her own personal fears and anxieties that maybe have nothing to do with the story.
The idea of, do these cloned babies count as people, which, right, to some people will sound absurd, and to others seems to, make sense. If you've already got people on the path of marriage is only between a man and a woman, and, the family unit, which we already have entrenched in our society, right, which we're already having battles over now, the implications of a baby that only comes from a woman counting as a person or having a soul is fascinating, and you put that in there. But then even from a scientific perspective, you have your main character go, the scientific thing they're basically saying is all of these count as identical twins, right? You don't consider identical twins not people.
Genetically identical, although they're different ages.
Yeah. But then what she was saying is, like, when she's interviewing one of the key pieces, one of the, like you were saying, the first people that kind of brings this story to light, who was at the compound, who had a bunch of children, right? And now she's raising them as a single mom. She's like, they also seem kind of weird, right? Like they're finishing each other's sentences. So this idea of, even she's starting to question, like, well, I'm setting the tone for what is going to be the future of this political issue, and I feel a certain way. They all count as people. But there are undertones that even make her start to question, which I thought was beautifully done. Or I hope I'm reading that right too. Maybe.
Yeah, no, that's where I was going. I think that there's this problem with advocacy, which is that advocacy, to be sort of broadly effective, doesn't admit subtlety, and the contrast, like the problem of someone who is simultaneously trying to have a nuanced understanding of an issue, but also trying to be an effective advocate for a side of an issue that she passionately believes in, was an interesting psychological conflict to me. So yeah, she really wants, being given this sort of unexpected opportunity, she was just sort of in the right place at the right time to shape a very quickly evolving national conversation about this condition. She wants to argue really strongly for the personhood of these parthenogenically created children, who will grow up to be, a large group of genetically identical women, but whom she doesn't want to have any fewer rights than anyone born any other way. And so she has to adopt this stance of confidence that anyone saying that, well, this will drastically change society is fear-mongering. But in fact, she is herself quite afraid of how the future might change, not just for this, but in general. She is sort of characterologically afraid of how the future might change. She's an anxious person. And she is an anxious person who's being faced with all of the anxieties of any new parent, whether, with a clone or just, a traditional new parent in the real world has, which is, suddenly I have this whole new, ethical and emotional investment in the future and what the future looks like. Because now I'm bringing a new person into it who's going to see more of it than I do. And so even as she's trying to advocate for sort of calm and normalcy, her fear is pushing her towards an understanding of the situation that might be more fraught. And the data, the only answer to sort of which side of that is more true can only come from experience. She's as well informed as anyone, and it's impossible for her to really know which is the case.
So you enter basically an audience avatar, Winston in the case of Ghostbusters, who can go, what is that? And they answer, and it doesn't seem stupid. You've got a journalist. That's almost a cheat code to do that, which you kind of mentioned. But by having her emotionally invested, first off, in terms of representation, right, you gave a female character agency, and you made that character much more nuanced. You didn't need that to be the case, right? You could have just had her writing the story. I've seen tons of stories that do that, right, that basically are just clippings of news articles about the big story to tell a big thing. I really liked that choice because it made that character more fleshed out. It's something I wish more authors would do. It's if you put a character in a story, there is no reason not to at least make that character meaningful, even if that character is only there for, a specific device. Even if they're the red shirt, which we might talk more later, you can flesh out the red shirt. You can give that character depth. And I feel a lot of people don't do that as writers.
I enjoy character-centric storytelling. I can enjoy non-character-centric storytelling, but one of the things, I mentioned that, two responses to that. I mentioned that I wrote a large portion of this as an MFA thesis. I went to a graduate school called the Iowa Writers Workshop, which is a fairly well-known, within certain circles, MFA program. It was the first MFA program in creative writing. And these days, when I'm getting my nails done, people sometimes ask me about it because the main character on HBO's show Girls just went there for a few episodes this season, apparently. But it's not traditionally a place where people write science fiction. Only recently has that been changing, and people have been writing science fiction and fantasy there. And when I started, I was the only person in my class who was a science fiction writer. And one of the things I wanted to do with this story was I wanted to write something that appealed to both sort of all of the things that people who like science fiction value in narrative, and that appealed to the things that people who like realist fiction value in narrative. So I wanted an interesting concept. I wanted a thorough exploration of premise. I wanted something that would inspire, a sense of wonder, as they say it. But I also wanted, deep characters and interiority and complicated psychology. And the story, my project in the story was to try to see if I could come up with kind of a seamless fusion of those two pleasures in fiction. The other thing I'd say is that, my main character is a woman, and basically everyone you see her interviewing are also women. She does interview men, but when she interviews men, you see those at a remove through her writing. This story intentionally does not pass the reverse Bechdel test. No two named male characters ever talk to each other, which I did because I wanted sort of a structural... I wanted to come up with sort of a structural embodiment of the sort of fear, the unease within the society about the future place of men, which is left up for grabs in the story. The story doesn't come down on one side or another. Some people in the story are arguing that it's they're going to become a minority, but not that much is going to change. And other people are saying they're going to go extinct. There are not going to be any men anymore. But this sort of unease, this there are not many stories where will men be relevant to society is a question that gets asked, and I felt like I needed to play every card I had. I feel like sort of patriarchal assumptions are so entrenched that I needed to play every card I had to try to unseat that for the sake of the effect I was going for. And so one of the things I did was never have any two men talk to each other in the story.
Yeah, I mean, what I will say, this is what people I think miss about that idea. So I would definitely qualify this as a piece of feminist writing, but that's funny to me that the bar, I hope in the future, we've talked in the past about Star Trek being progressive for its time, but then as you go forward 30 years in the future and you look at basically a white male who's going around having sex with every female in the galaxy and a bunch of token minorities, that Star Trek shouldn't be still viewed as progressive, is viewed as progressive then. And I actually feel Frozen is going to be the same way. I'm hoping Frozen, that is now getting a lot of credit for being a very feminist piece of Disney literature that goes back on a lot of the conventional tropes, that in like 20 years we look at that and we're like, their wrists are still tiny and their eyes are still big and they still have to make out with the guy, and there's still a really weird scene about just them hooking up, like a song number, which is it. Go back and watch the Troll song number, like Fixer Upper, and it should make you feel a little queasy. That's my thought. So I'm saying it makes me feel sad that the bar is low enough to be like, well, your character, your story has a bunch of female characters and is about a female issue, and that qualifies it as like feminist science fiction. I'm hoping in the future someone like watches this podcast and is like, what were they smoking back then? That's my hope, future listener. But I definitely think it does qualify there. And I do think, to like your point, it's like there are enough stories about certain things. I actually just picked up Piers Anthony's Cruel Eye and reread it and loved it again. But I realized the story of like the Stockholm Syndrome, they fall in love adventure story is very well worn. And it's like, we can tell other stories. Maybe we have enough of those in the universe. Maybe we can tell something else. I think you've said that, and I'm really glad you did here.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. I mean, I hope it was feminist. I tried to make it feminist. I'm unabashedly would claim that label. But I certainly don't think every character in the story is a feminist. And I think that there are some characters in the story who are feminists, but are maybe nevertheless wrong about some things. Like I hope that it doesn't come across as a didactic story. Certainly, that wasn't my intent with it. Go for it.
One of the things that bugs me about people's perception of feminist work in terms of fiction. So I saw somebody write out that Frozen isn't feminist because Elsa, that's her name, right? The evil queen, because she's a horrible role model, right? Like she acts terribly a bunch in the movie and she's not a good feminist. She's not, she herself in the story doesn't count as feminist, and she's not a role model. And I went, that's the point. Like, the reason that movie is feminist is because you let your characters make bad decisions. That's the problem with a lot of female characters in books and literature, is that we basically don't let them mess up. We basically, that is what makes a feminist character, is when you give them agency. And so to your point in this book, right, you have lots of weird stuff too. One of the really interesting tweaks you made, I thought this clever part of your narrative, is the implication of how society will view a woman who is pregnant with a female baby. Because if they haven't been tested, that's a possibility. I thought that was a really nice callback to like the AIDS epidemic, right? Is people being afraid to shake the hands of a pregnant woman if they don't know the gender of the baby.
Yeah.
And so you have female characters in this book that like aren't acting feminist, but that to me is what makes this story fascinating, is that you have textured female characters and you have nuance and depth to your characters. Even your characters that are quote unquote on the right side can still act in ways that you as the reader don't approve of.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, women in fiction should have access to sort of the full range of human experience, just like men in fiction. It's why do these things seem notable to us? Well, because such a preponderance of fiction has had women in only very narrowly prescribed roles that simply think something as simple as mere agency can seem transgressive. But probably like this Frozen that you were mentioning, this person saying, well, it's not feminist because, to paraphrase, she's not a saint. I mean, this is like I think I can understand where that impulse comes from in that you sort of, after years and years of having terrible representation, you kind of want something that's being held up as good representation to address everything that's wrong and fix every problem. But that's, again, I don't think that's good storytelling. I think that instead what you want is just a diversity of stories that let women have full access to human experience.
Well, I think characters being flawed, to me, is key. Like, I think a lot of good writers write that. It is really hard. I mean, we've talked Superman on the show before. It's not impossible, but it is really hard to write perfect characters. And even Superman, some of the best Superman writing comes from the idea of what is the right thing to do. You have all this power. You want to do the right thing. What is the right thing? So even in this, like I said, doing a callback to it again, because it's still one of my favorite parts of the book, what she chooses to write is wildly important, and she realizes it. And she has internal monologue with herself, basically struggling with, how do I write this story? I have all these facts. I've talked to all these people. I'm probably one of the most knowledgeable people in the world on this subject now. But I know my work is going to be read, and how it's read is going to be perceived a certain way. So how I write it is important, and there are ethical. Any writer has that, right? Whenever, even me, when I write about sports stars, right? Like, it's worth noting that I don't bring up what a terrible person Michael Jordan is. I don't bring up all of the transgressions. Magic Johnson, he did get AIDS. Part of that was because he was a notorious partier and did lots of things that probably don't make him a role model. So what do you write about when you're writing about someone, when you want, when the goal of my article is Magic Johnson was an impressive basketball player, I choose to leave out a lot of stuff, even basketball related, because I want a specific thing to go out. And that, as a writer, that can be tough to deal with.
Yeah, I mean, when I taught writing, I taught fiction writing at Iowa, and one of the things that I told my students is, like, there's no such thing as apolitical fiction.
Have you seen, I forget his name, and it may have been pulled down. It was on Shea Apocalypse. I think his name is Folding Chair. But during, like, Gamergate, he wrote something about that. And he said the exact same thing you just said. He said, all work is political. He pointed out something that I hadn't even thought of I'm sorry to steal the mic again, hadn't even thought of in United States pop culture, is the deference we give to military and police. Just like in Superman, that was the example he used. Superman respects the military. We're given no reason in the story why Superman is, but that is the movie industry itself saying military is important, even in this world of gods, essentially, right? These people that just have military uniforms on are important. That is a political statement, even if you as the writer did not realize you were being political.
There are default assumptions under everything that you write, and so the sort of the act of responsible authorship is to investigate those assumptions and to be employing them knowingly, as opposed to sort of subconsciously or haphazardly. If you think that what you're doing is apolitical, that just means that you aren't aware of the underlying assumptions beneath your work.
Well, and it's hard to know about that. I find that what you just said. So we had a podcast on the Box Score Geek this week about the NCAA, and we briefly, not because it's not important, by the way, people listen, but we briefly talked about the racial aspect. And someone hopped in and said, I don't like seeing this framed as a racial issue. And I kind of just did like the face palm and was like, it doesn't matter if you don't like it. You're not solving the problem. You're not actually being the word colorblind, right? You're not actually handling racism by being colorblind. You're actually just defaulting to letting it go on by saying this isn't a race issue. So is what it is.
Right. Yeah. The colorblindness, the progressive notion of fixing the problems of racial inequality by saying that the things racial minorities complain about don't actually exist.
Like, you hit a lot of stuff and I didn't even get to notice all of them. But like, having Mendoza, it occurs to me as a Hispanic person, even just having Hispanic representation is such a win in pop culture at this point, because we don't exist. Like, you go to any Walmart, Target, King Soopers, whatever the stores in your area are called, I guarantee you the overnight crew is like 80% Hispanic. I didn't realize this. I just saw the movie Chef with John
I'm in
Favreau.
Central Texas, so yeah.
Oh yeah, you know. But have you seen the movie Chef with John Favreau?
I've not.
Fantastic movie. I really liked it, and it really struck home with me. And something that didn't really occur to me was that it had a lot of Hispanic characters in it. And he mentioned it was when he was researching kitchens, they have mostly Hispanic workers. So that's like, to me, it was such a weird thing to not even realize that, to just be like, oh, I'm in a movie, like not me, but like someone with the same skin color as me is in a movie, and normally we're not. Was it actually really struck home with me, and it needed to be pointed out. I listened to the director's commentary and was like, oh, so even your book, I mean, I didn't even notice that because there was so much other stuff good in it, but it's just like, yeah, that simple tweak that you as an author made, instead of doing Smith or Jones, which would have been easy, that's huge.
Yeah. Well, I was mercenary when I was coming up with this character. Like, what was interesting to me, because the story is all about sort of shifting societal definitions, and, you know, who society defines as in-group and who society defines as out-group. And you made the comment earlier that, you know, even 20 years ago, gay people were sort of universally defined as out-group. They were, they were othered. They were sort of this scary, confusing thing to huge swaths of society. And because I was writing a story about sort of a shift of those definitions, a change in who would be considered in-group and who would be considered out-group, I wanted to write the story through the eyes of someone who would be on the boundary, of someone who, like, before would be out-group but would potentially shift to being in-group, or someone who's at least right on the border between those in sort of the new world. And so we've got this mixed race, Mexican, Lebanese, American, gay woman, which is, you know, in one respect ticking boxes, but in another respect, at least as far as she knows, still a sexual reproducer, not an asexual reproducer. And so once the lines, you know, get redefined as being between the sexual reproducers and the parthenogenic reproducers, she would go from being sort of on, like, the periphery of traditional society to someone that traditional society would want to claim. And sort of that identity conflict for her was something that I wanted to play with, which is why I sort of positioned her within the world the way I did.
So I picture a future where you're a famous author. You're already well on your way, right? So we'll put the Stratus.
So do I. Yeah.
Okay, so with that in mind, I'm going to prepare you, because I'm going to be the fan that's going to piss you off, and I'm going to do it on my podcast.
All right.
Okay.
Piss me off, Trey.
You very intentionally made an open-ended, ambiguous ending.
The last scene of the story is Tess and her partner Judy going in for a sonogram.
Oh, sonogram. Sorry, not the birth. Yeah.
To find out the sex of their child.
I don't know why I thought it was birth, but yeah. So they get the gender of the baby. And so say her spouse's name one more time.
Judy Wyatt, but that's actually not in the story.
Oh, nice. Behind the scenes here. Okay, so the end is Tess starts crying, basically. Like, you have, like, I wish I was quicker. I should have been smarter about this, because I actually do have it in front of me. And if I was even more clever, I would have like, you prepared to, like, read it.
Oh, I can do that right now if you like.
Okay, so can you read, like, the very last paragraph?
Sure. I'll read the very last part of the story.
Curse you, like, this is one thing about Kindles, is I cannot skip ahead as fast as I could in normal.
I've got it on paper. This is the cover of it. So the very end of the story is they're in a car. Tess sort of thinks about the various rhetorical questions we were speaking of earlier. And then it says, when they got to BioPeak and signed in, Judy waved away the clipboard of forms. She produced from her bag a set she'd downloaded, printed, and already filled out. The nurses had Tess in the back and on the exam table in under 5 minutes. This is going to be a bit gooey, said the ultrasound technician as she squirted gel onto Tess's skin and spread it around with the end of the wand. Some of the gel got on her sweater, and Tess could feel Judy biting back commentary. Her grip tightened around Judy's hand. The wand could have been the flat of a blade, and Tess didn't think she would feel any differently. When Tess was sufficiently slimed, the technician started up the machine. Ghostly shadows resolved on the screen. It looked like nothing in particular, a confusion of internal architecture, until the technician pointed to a part of the haze and said, "There's the head." Then suddenly the image resolved into a moving cross-section of a fetus, and it was impossible to see it as anything else. The plane of the scan swept through the baby's body, forward and back, hands and feet coalescing into view and then dissolving again. The technician pushed some buttons, and a 3D computer rendering appeared on the screen. It looked like a clay model put under running water. She panned the image to get a view between the legs. And there we have it. It's a girl. Look at that. Judy's voice was a rush of astonished delight. Decaf's a girl. We have a lumpy little daughter. Tess felt the startled fish flutter of Decaf moving, and simultaneously watched her on the screen twist her hips out of view, as if shy. A motion Tess realized she knew, a gesture she'd felt so many times. We can burn a movie of this to DVD if you want to buy, said the technician. For you to buy if you want, said the technician. A noise escaped from Tess's chest, a racked sound that convulsed her body and scrambled the image on the screen. It happened again, and then again. What is it? Said Judy. Are you okay? Tess started to answer, but the words got caught and bubbled in her nose. She clapped her hands to her face in embarrassment. Her cheeks were wet. Leave us alone for a minute, Judy told the technician, who put down the wand and started for the door. No, Tess finally got out. Come back. It's fine. She couldn't tell if the technician listened or not. Her vision was too watery to see. Under Tess's hand on her shoulder, her body still shook with sobs. It's all right, she gasped. There's nothing wrong. Nothing is wrong. And that's how it ends.